The briefing room fell silent except for the hum of the overhead projector. Colonel Marcus Haverly leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching the man standing at attention before him with barely concealed amusement. The pilot's flight suit was worn at the elbows, his boots scuffed beyond regulation, and there was a tiredness in his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and struggles that had nothing to do with combat. Captain James Reyes had requested a transfer to the 77th Fighter Squadron, one of the most elite units in the Air Force, and Haverly was already composing his rejection in his mind. The colonel had seen dozens like him, decent pilots ground down by life's weight, thinking a prestigious posting would somehow fix everything that was broken. Reyes shifted his weight, and Haverly caught sight of the worn wedding band on his left hand, noticed the slight tremor in his fingers. Single father, he'd read in the file. Wife died 3 years ago, 2 daughters 7 and 9. Performance reviews adequate but not exceptional, nothing that screamed elite squadron material. Haverly glanced at Major Patricia Vance standing by the door, and she met his eyes with the same skeptical expression. They'd built the 77th together, turned it into something legendary. They didn't have room for charity cases, no matter how sympathetic. Captain Reyes, Haverly began, his tone carrying just enough edge to make it clear this meeting was already over. I've reviewed your request. I'm sure you're a capable pilot, but the 77th isn't just about being capable. We need the best, people who can dedicate everything to the mission. He let that last word hang in the air, watched Reyes' jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. I have 2 daughters, sir, Reyes said quietly. That doesn't mean I can't be the best. Haverly actually laughed then, a short bark that made Vance wince. Son, I'm not questioning your dedication to your family. I'm questioning whether you have anything left to give to this squadron. The 77th demands. I know what the 77th demands, sir, Reyes interrupted, and there was something in his voice now, something sharp beneath the exhaustion. I know because my instructor at flight school wouldn't stop talking about it, about what it meant, about the legacy. Haverly's smile faded slightly. Your instructor. Reyes reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, faded photograph. He placed it carefully on Haverly's desk. The colonel leaned forward and his breath caught. The photograph showed a young woman in a flight suit standing in front of an F-16, her helmet tucked under one arm. Her call sign was stenciled on the aircraft's fuselage. Revenant. Haverly's hand moved toward the photograph almost involuntarily, then stopped. His face had gone completely pale. The photograph remained on the desk between them, a small rectangle of faded color that seemed to draw all the air from the room. Major Vance had moved closer, and when she saw the image, her expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching shock. Colonel Haverly's hand hovered over the picture, trembling now, before he finally picked it up with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his previous demeanor. Where did you get this? His voice had changed entirely, stripped of its earlier condescension. Captain Reyes stood straighter, and for the first time since entering the briefing room, he looked like something more than a tired man begging for a second chance. Captain Alara Voss gave it to me during my 2nd week at flight school. I was washing out, couldn't handle the pressure, kept making mistakes, and my instructor said I didn't have what it took. He paused, his eyes distant. She found me in the hangar at midnight, sitting in a cockpit, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. She didn't say much at first, just climbed up and sat on the wing beside me. Haverly was staring at the photograph as if it might disappear. She was your instructor for 6 weeks. She wasn't officially assigned to training duty. She was just passing through the base after a deployment. But she started showing up to watch our training flights, and one day she pulled me aside. Reyes' voice softened. She told me that being a pilot wasn't about being fearless. It was about knowing exactly what you had to lose and flying anyway. She said the best pilots she'd ever known were the ones who carried weight on the ground because they never forgot why they were in the sky. Major Vance spoke for the first time, her voice careful. Captain Voss was transferred out of the 77th 12 years ago. We haven't heard from her since. Transferred? Reyes looked between them, confusion crossing his face. She told me she founded the squadron, that it was her legacy. Haverly set the photograph down gently as if it might shatter. When he looked up at Reyes, his eyes were different, haunted almost. She didn't found the 77th, she saved it. We were a squadron in name only back then, cobbled together from pilots nobody else wanted. Alara was the first. She was. He stopped, his jaw working. She made us believe we could be something. The colonel stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the flight line. 3 F-16s sat on the tarmac, their canopies glinting in the afternoon sun. We called her Revenant because she survived things that should have killed her. 3 times. Once over hostile territory in Afghanistan when her aircraft took fire and she flew 40 miles on one engine with half her hydraulics gone. Once in a training accident that the investigation board said was unsurvivable. And once. He trailed off, his reflection in the glass showing an expression of barely contained emotion. Once in a way that none of us understood until it was too late. Reyes felt ice forming in his chest. "Sir, what happened to Captain Voss?" Haverly turned back and his face was carved from stone. "You said she gave you this photograph 6 years ago." "Yes, sir." 6 years ago, Alara Voss was already dead. The words hung in the air like ordnance waiting to detonate. Captain Reyes felt his legs weaken, and he caught himself against the edge of Haverly's desk. Major Vance moved quickly to steady him, her hand on his elbow firm and grounding. The colonel was watching him with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as if Reyes held answers to questions that had been tearing Haverly apart for years. "That's not possible," Reyes said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She was there. She flew with me. She taught me the Kandahar reversal maneuver, that impossible split-S recovery she was famous for. She knew things about flying that aren't in any manual." Haverly crossed the room in 3 strides and gripped Reyes's shoulders. "What exactly did she teach you?" "Every detail. Everything she said." Reyes's mind raced backward, trying to reconstruct those 6 weeks that had transformed him from a washout into a pilot who'd survived 5 combat deployments. "She taught me to read the sky like a language. How to feel the aircraft's limits before the instruments showed them. She had this way of explaining energy management that made everything click. She said flying was like conducting a conversation between physics and will. The sky speaks in verbs, not nouns," Haverly whispered, and Reyes's eyes widened. "That's exactly what she said. How did you?" "Because that's what she told all of us. Every pilot in the original 77th heard those words." The colonel released him and returned to his desk, pulling open a locked drawer. He removed a folder so worn the edges had gone soft, and from it he extracted a newspaper clipping yellowed with age. He placed it beside the photograph. The headline read, "Fighter pilot killed in training exercise. Squadron mourns loss of Captain Alara Voss." The date was 13 years ago. Reyes stared at the clipping, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. "There was a memorial service," Vance said quietly. "The entire squadron attended. We watched her casket loaded onto a C-130. Her parents were there, her younger brother. He was 19. She paused. "He joined the Air Force 2 years later." "Thomas Voss," Reyes said suddenly, and both officers stared at him. "The name you fly under, is it really Reyes?" Haverly's expression shifted to something between shock and understanding. "Your transfer request said James Reyes." "Your service record says James Reyes." "It is Reyes, my wife's name. I took it when we married because my father was—" He stopped, his voice breaking. "Because my father was never there. But before that my name was Thomas Voss. Alara was my sister." The briefing room's fluorescent lights buzzed in the sudden silence. Major Vance sat down heavily, and Colonel Haverly braced himself against the desk as if the room had tilted. Outside, a jet engine roared to life, the sound muffled by distance and glass but present enough to remind them all where they were, what they were. "You were 19 at her memorial," Haverly said finally. "I remember you. You didn't speak to anyone, you just stood there in your dress uniform, staring at the flag on her casket." "I was angry," Thomas admitted. "At her, at the Air Force, at God. She promised me she'd come home. She promised." The confession hung between them like a flare in darkness, illuminating truths that had been buried under years of grief and silence. Thomas Voss, the man who'd walked into the briefing room as Captain James Reyes, exhausted single father and adequate pilot, now stood revealed as something else entirely. The brother of a legend, carrying a weight that suddenly made sense of the tiredness in his eyes, the worn edges of his uniform, the way he'd held himself like a man who'd lost everything that mattered. Colonel Haverly sank into his chair, and for the first time since Thomas had known him, even from those distant memories of the memorial service where the colonel had been a figure carved from military bearing and suppressed emotion, he looked old. "She didn't die in that training exercise," Haverly said, and Major Vance's head snapped toward him. "Marcus, we agreed we'd never. He deserves to know. He's her brother." Haverly met Thomas's eyes across the desk. "And he's been talking to her." Thomas felt reality sliding sideways. "Sir, I don't understand. The newspaper, the memorial service you just said. We held the service because the Air Force needed closure, because her parents needed closure, because the squadron needed to move forward." Haverly's hands were flat on the desk, pressing down as if to anchor himself. "But Alara didn't die that day. She crashed, yes. The aircraft was destroyed, but she ejected in time. Found her 3 miles from the crash site, unconscious but alive. Then why? Because of what happened next." The colonel stood and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out another folder, this one marked with classification stamps. He hesitated, then opened it. The crash wasn't mechanical failure. It was sabotage. Someone had tampered with the fuel system. The investigation found evidence of deliberate interference, but before we could identify the responsible party, there were complications. Vance picked up the thread, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Someone wanted her dead, Thomas. Someone with access to our aircraft, our base, our systems. The OSI investigation hit walls everywhere it turned. Whoever was behind it had protection, had reach. And then Alara started receiving threats, not just against her, but against her family, against you." Thomas felt his knees buckle, and this time he let himself sit. "So they faked her death." "We faked her death," Haverly corrected. "The squadron, OSI, a handful of people who understood what was at stake. We held the service, we filed the reports, and Alara disappeared. Into witness protection, theoretically. But Alara being Alara, she couldn't just vanish. She had to stay close to flying. She became an instructor," Thomas whispered. "Under a different name, with papers that would pass initial scrutiny but wouldn't survive deep investigation. That's why she was only at flight school for 6 weeks. That's why she told you she was just passing through." Haverly's voice carried a mix of admiration and frustration. She couldn't help herself. She saw a pilot who reminded her of why she'd fallen in love with flying in the first place, and she had to try to save him. Thomas looked at the photograph, seeing it now with different eyes. His sister, alive when he'd believed her dead, teaching him to fly the way she'd once taught herself, with passion and precision, and a deep understanding that the sky was both sanctuary and proving ground. Where is she now? The question fell into silence so profound that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat. Colonel Haverly and Major Vance exchanged a look weighted with something that made Thomas's chest tighten. Not quite pity, not quite resignation, but something that lived in the space between knowing and telling. Haverly walked back to the window, his posture rigid with the kind of discipline that came from containing too much emotion for too long. "We don't know," he said finally, and the admission seemed to cost him. The last confirmed sighting was 8 years ago. She was instructing at a civilian flight school in Montana, using the name Elena Marsh. One of our retired pilots recognized her teaching a student the Kandahar reversal. He didn't approach her, didn't compromise her, just sent word through back channels. By the time OSI could coordinate a protective detail, she was gone. Thomas stood, his body moving before his mind caught up. "You're telling me my sister has been alive for 13 years, moving from place to place, teaching pilots who have no idea who she really is, and nobody has been able to find her." "She doesn't want to be found," Vance said. "Every time we get close, she disappears. She knows how we think, how we operate. She trained most of the people who'd be looking for her." Her voice softened. "But she also can't seem to stay away from flying, from pilots, from passing on what she knows." 6 years ago she was at Randolph," Thomas said, his mind working through the implications. "That's where I met her, where she taught me, which means she knew exactly who I was." Haverly turned from the window. "Of course she knew. You think it was coincidence she showed up at the base where her little brother was washing out of flight school?" The words hit Thomas like turbulence. "She came because of me." "She's been watching over you your entire career," Haverly said. "We didn't realize it until now, but looking back, Every assignment you've had, there have been signs. A letter of recommendation from an instructor who doesn't quite exist. A training report filed by someone whose credentials don't match the database. Performance reviews that are just slightly too insightful to have come from the officers whose names are on them. Thomas pulled out his phone with shaking hands, scrolling through photos until he found what he was looking for. A picture of his daughters, taken 3 months ago at their school's air show. He enlarged it, focusing on the background, and his breath caught. Behind the crowd of parents and children, partially obscured by a hangar door, was a woman in sunglasses and a baseball cap. Her posture was distinctive, weight on her back foot, arms crossed, head tilted at an angle that Thomas suddenly recognized because he stood exactly the same way. "She's been at my daughter's school," he said, showing the phone to Haverly. "This was taken in August. I never noticed her before, but now." Vance took the phone, studying the image with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years in intelligence work. "That's definitely her. The stance, the way she's positioned to have clear sightlines in multiple directions, even the sunglasses, she always preferred that brand." She looked up at Thomas. "She's been protecting you, all of you." The revelation settled over Thomas like a flight suit that finally fit properly after years of wearing something cut for someone else. Every unexplained moment of his career suddenly snapped into focus. The training report that had saved him from dismissal when he'd nearly crashed during a night navigation exercise. The recommendation that had gotten him into advanced tactical training despite his mediocre scores. The anonymous tip that had warned him about structural issues with his aircraft 2 days before a hydraulic line failed. Not luck, not coincidence. Ilara. His sister had been conducting a Guardian mission that had lasted his entire adult life, operating in the shadows with the same precision she'd once brought to combat sorties, watching over him while letting him believe she was dead. Why didn't she tell me? Thomas heard the pain in his own voice, raw and adolescent despite 13 years of distance. Why let me think she was gone? Haverly sat heavily, and for the first time Thomas saw past the colonel's armor to the man underneath, someone who'd also lost Ilara in a different way, and who'd been carrying that loss like shrapnel lodged too close to vital organs to extract. "Because telling you would have made you a target," Haverly said. "Whoever wanted her dead had resources, had patience. If they'd known she survived, they would have come for the people she loved. You, your parents. And they would have watched those people, waiting for her to make contact. But she did make contact. She taught me to fly." 6 years ago, Vance interjected, which means 6 years ago something changed. The threat level decreased, or she decided the risk was worth taking, or, she paused, her expression darkening, or she knew time was running out and wanted to pass something on to you while she still could. Thomas felt ice crystallize in his veins. "What do you mean time was running out?" Neither officer answered immediately, and in their silence Thomas heard everything they weren't saying. He'd spent enough years in the military to recognize the specific quality of quiet that came before bad news, the way senior officers gathered themselves before delivering information that would change someone's life trajectory. "Sir, what happened 6 years ago?" Still silence. Thomas's voice hardened, the exhausted single father disappearing beneath the combat pilot he'd been trained to be. "Colonel Haverly, you brought me in here. You showed me evidence that my sister is alive. You don't get to stop now." Haverly's jaw worked, and when he finally spoke his voice was barely above a whisper. 6 years ago, we received medical records through the same back channels Ilara had been using to communicate. She'd been diagnosed with glioblastoma, brain cancer, aggressive type. The report indicated she'd refused treatment that might have saved her life because it would have required using her real identity, going into a proper hospital system where she could be traced. Thomas couldn't breathe. The briefing room tilted, and he gripped the edge of the desk to keep from falling. Brain cancer. 6 years ago. Which meant when she'd found him in that hangar at midnight, when she'd sat on the wing and taught him to see flying as a conversation between physics and will, she'd already been dying. "She spent her last months teaching me," Thomas said, and it wasn't a question. "She knew she didn't have long, so she came to Randolph to make sure I wouldn't wash out." "She came to give you her legacy," Vance said quietly. The weight of that legacy pressed down on Thomas like G-forces during a hard turn, threatening to gray out his vision. He stood motionless in the briefing room, surrounded by the artifacts of his sister's secret life. The photograph, the classified files, the newspaper clipping announcing a death that hadn't happened but might as well have. 13 years of believing Alara was gone, then 5 minutes of learning she'd been alive, then another 5 of understanding she was likely dead anyway, truly dead this time, from something that couldn't be ejected from or outmaneuvered. The cruelty of it was almost incomprehensible. Did she suffer? The question came out barely above a whisper. Haverly's expression fractured, revealing genuine anguish beneath his military bearing. We don't know. The medical records were dated 6 years ago. We've had no confirmed contact since then. No sightings, no anonymous letters, nothing. He paused, seeming to age a decade in the space between words. Glioblastoma patients rarely survive more than 18 months without treatment, with treatment maybe 5 years. Alara refused treatment. Thomas did the math automatically, the way pilots calculated fuel consumption and range. 6 years since diagnosis. 5 years maximum with treatment she'd refused. Which meant if the timeline held, if the statistics were accurate, Alara had been gone for at least 4 years. Dead while he'd been changing diapers, attending parent-teacher conferences, flying missions over hostile territory, living the life she'd secretly orchestrated for him. The photograph, Thomas said suddenly. She gave it to me in person. I held it. 6 years ago, she was healthy enough to climb onto an F-16's wing, healthy enough to fly instruction missions. How is that possible with brain cancer? Vance pulled out her tablet, accessing medical files with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd reviewed them many times before. Glioblastoma can be asymptomatic in early stages. Some patients remain functional for months before symptoms appear. Headaches, vision problems, motor control issues. They come gradually, then all at once. She looked up, her eyes reflecting a sadness that Thomas recognized as personal, not professional. She would have known what was coming. She was smart enough to research the disease, understand the progression. She knew she was giving you her last flight hours. The phrase hit Thomas like turbulence, her last flight hours. Every pilot understood that concept viscerally. The final time you'd feel the stick in your hand, the throttle responding to your touch, the moment of rotation when wheels left runway and everything else fell away. Lara had spent hers teaching her little brother to fly properly, passing on knowledge that represented a lifetime of pushing boundaries and surviving the unsurvivable. I need to know if she's alive, Thomas said, and his voice carried a determination that made both senior officers straighten. The medical records are 6 years old. Sightings stopped, but that doesn't mean she's dead. It means she got better at hiding, or she's somewhere we haven't looked, or she's still moving and we're just not seeing the pattern. Haverly shook his head slowly. Thomas, I understand what you're feeling, but, with respect, sir, you don't. Thomas's voice cut through the colonel's objection like a knife through clouds. You lost a squadron mate, a fellow pilot. I lost my sister. She's the reason I'm alive. Not just because she taught me to fly, but because when our father walked out, when our mother was working 3 jobs just to keep us fed, Alara was the one who made me believe I could be something. The personal history spilled out now, uncontained, flooding the briefing room with context that transformed Thomas from a pilot requesting transfer into a complete human being shaped by specific losses and particular loves. Haverly and Vance listened with the stillness of people who understood that sometimes intelligence gathering meant simply bearing witness to truth. Our father left when I was 6, Thomas continued, his voice steady despite the emotion underneath. Just walked out one morning and never came back. Alara was 14. She became the parent our mother couldn't be because she was too busy trying to survive. Alara made my lunches, checked my homework, showed up to parent-teacher conferences pretending to be our aunt when mom couldn't get off work. He pulled out his wallet, extracting a second photograph, this one showing 2 children, a teenage girl with her arm around a small boy, both grinning at the camera with a beat-up Cessna visible in the background. She took me to the airport every Sunday. We couldn't afford flying lessons, so we just watched the planes. She'd explain what the pilots were doing, why they held patterns the way they did, how to read the wind from the way aircraft approached. She learned all of it from books and observation because we had nothing else. Thomas's thumb traced the edge of the photograph. When I was 12, she joined the Air Force. Enlisted first, then made officer, then flight school. She sent money home every month, enough that Mom could drop down to 2 jobs, enough that I could join the high school aviation club. Every letter she wrote included something new about flying, technical details, stories about her training, advice about how to think like a pilot even if I was still earthbound. Vance moved closer, studying the photograph with professional interest that had shifted into something more personal. She was building you a roadmap, she said, showing you the way forward step by step. She was giving me her dream, Thomas corrected. Because by the time I was ready for flight school, she'd already made captain, already joined the 77th, already become revenant. She could have focused entirely on her own career, on becoming the best. Instead, she spent her leave time visiting me at college, helping me prepare for the qualifying exams, making sure I understood that flying wasn't just about skill. It was about knowing what you were flying for. Haverly had been silent during this recitation, but now he spoke with the weight of someone who'd made a decision that would ripple forward in unpredictable ways. The 77th, he said slowly, was Ilara's dream before it was mine. When she arrived, we were a collection of misfits, pilots who'd screwed up in other squadrons, officers being punished with dead-end assignments, kids fresh out of training who hadn't distinguished themselves enough for the glamorous postings. She walked into that mess and saw potential. She told me the squadron was her family, Thomas said. In her letters, she talked about you and Major Vance and the others like you were the family she'd chosen. Better than blood, she said, because you chose each other every day. The words seemed to strike Haverly physically. He turned away, walking to the wall where squadron photographs hung in chronological order, years of classes, deployments, ceremonies. He stopped before one particular image, the original 77th, taken 14 years ago, before the squadron had earned its reputation. 20 pilots stood in formation before a pair of F-16s, and in the center stood Ilara Voss. Younger than Thomas remembered her, smiling with the confidence of someone who believed the future was something you built rather than something that happened to you. The photograph on the wall represented a moment frozen before everything fell apart, before sabotage, before the crash that wasn't fatal but might as well have been, before Ilara Voss became a ghost haunting the margins of the Air Force she'd loved. Colonel Haverly stared at it with an expression Thomas recognized from mirrors, the look of someone trying to reconcile memory with absence, trying to hold onto something that kept slipping away like contrails dissipating in clear sky. She held us together through sheer force of will, Haverly said, his voice distant with recollection. Half the squadron wanted transfers within the first month. The other half was actively trying to fail out, but Ilara wouldn't let us quit. She organized extra training sessions on her own time. She bought pizza for the enlisted crew chiefs with her own money so they'd feel valued. She created competitions between flights to build esprit de corps. He touched the glass covering the photograph, his finger hovering over Ilara's image. She turned us into a family by making us believe we were worth being one. Major Vance had moved to stand beside him, her own gaze fixed on the photograph. She also protected us, Vance added. From ourselves, from the brass who wanted to disband the squadron, from the accidents that could have ended careers. When Lieutenant Morrison crashed during a training run and froze on the radio, Ilara talked him through the restart sequence while flying formation beside him, close enough that she could see his face through the canopy. She flew him home, literally packing him through every step until his wheels touched down. Thomas knew the story. It had been one of the legends whispered through flight school, though no one had mentioned Ilara's name. The anonymous hero who'd saved a pilot everyone else had written off, who'd risked her own aircraft to stay close enough to keep another pilot from dying alone in the sky. How many people did she save? He asked. Haverly and Vance exchanged glances, conducting a silent conversation born from years of shared command. Finally Vance spoke, directly, 4 pilots whose aircraft malfunction should have been fatal. Indirectly, the entire squadron multiple times. She uncovered safety issues before they became disasters. She identified problems with maintenance protocols that would have killed someone eventually, and she trained us to be better than we thought possible. She also made enemies, Haverly said, returning to his desk with the weariness of someone carrying a burden too long. When you're that good, that visible, that unwilling to accept the status quo, you threaten people who have built careers on mediocrity. Alara didn't just expose safety issues, she exposed the people whose negligence created them. She didn't just excel, she made everyone else's failures more obvious by contrast. Thomas felt a familiar anger rising, the same rage that had consumed him at 19 when he'd stood at his sister's memorial service. Someone killed her because she was too good at her job. Someone tried to kill her because she was too dangerous to their interests, Vance corrected. We never identified who, but the investigation suggested it went higher than we could reach. Contracts worth millions, safety regulations that would have cost defense contractors billions to implement, inspection protocols that would have revealed systemic problems across multiple bases. Alara threatened all of it just by being meticulous and refusing to compromise. The scope of it overwhelmed Thomas, not just a murder attempt but a conspiracy that had tentacles reaching throughout the military-industrial complex, that had been powerful enough to force his sister into permanent hiding, that might still be active even now. If the threat was that substantial, he said slowly, then coming here, revealing who I am, might have just painted a target on my back. The realization spread through the briefing room like fuel vapor, invisible but potentially explosive. Major Vance stiffened, her hand moving instinctively toward the secure phone on Haverly's desk. The colonel's face cycled through several emotions in rapid succession: shock at his own oversight, calculation as he assessed the threat level, and finally a grim determination that Thomas recognized as the expression of a commanding officer accepting responsibility for a mistake. "How long have I been here?" Thomas asked, his combat training overriding the emotional upheaval of the last hour. "How many people saw me enter this building? Who's monitoring base security feeds?" Haverly was already moving, pulling up a terminal and typing with practiced urgency. 37 minutes since you entered the building. You checked in at the gate under your legal name, Reyes. Base security logged you as a routine transfer consultation. His fingers flew across the keyboard. But if someone's been watching for Voss family connections, cross-referencing squadron assignments, monitoring transfer requests to the 77th specifically, then they know I'm here, Thomas finished. And they know I'm her brother, which means they know she made contact with me 6 years ago, which means they know she might have told me things. What things? Vance had her sidearm out now, not aimed at anything but present in a way that made the situation's gravity unmistakable. What could Alara have told you that would matter after 6 years? Thomas's mind raced backward through those weeks at Randolph, trying to remember everything Alara had said beyond flying technique. She talked about reading the sky, about trusting instruments but also trusting instinct, about the importance of knowing when rules were guidelines versus when they were survival imperatives. But there had been other moments too, quieter conversations during post-flight debriefings where she'd seemed to be teaching him something beyond aviation. "She taught me about documentation," he said slowly, the memory crystallizing. "She said pilots who wanted long careers learned to keep records of everything. Not just flight logs, but maintenance reports, briefing notes, conversations with commanders. She said the paper trail was sometimes the only thing that protected you when people tried to rewrite history." Haverly went very still. "Did she give you any documents, files, reports, anything physical or digital?" "No, sir, but she told me where to look." Thomas pulled out his phone again, navigating to a notes app he'd maintained for years. "She said if I ever needed to understand why the Air Force worked the way it did, I should read the accident investigation reports that got classified rather than published. She gave me specific case numbers." Vance was beside him instantly, reading over his shoulder. "These are all training accidents from 12 to 15 years ago, multiple bases, different aircraft types. Her voice rose slightly. Thomas, these are the cases Alara was investigating before her crash. These are what she died protecting. What she almost died protecting, Thomas corrected, and what she made sure I could find if something happened to her. He looked up at both officers. She didn't just teach me to fly. She made me her backup plan. If the people who tried to kill her ever thought the evidence was truly gone, I'd still have enough to reconstruct it. The implications settled over them like smoke, heavy, suffocating, inescapable. Colonel Haverly's office suddenly felt less like a briefing room and more like a tactical situation with hostile forces converging on an unsecured position. The colonel moved with the decisive efficiency of someone who'd commanded combat operations, pulling secure phones from a safe, activating protocols that Thomas only half understood. Major Vance had positioned herself near the door, her weapon now openly displayed, her body language shifting from administrative officer to security detail. "We need to move you to a secure location," Haverly said, his voice clipped and professional despite the tension radiating from him. "If they've been monitoring for Voss family connections, we have maybe 30 minutes before someone comes asking questions we can't safely answer in this building." Thomas felt the old instincts kicking in, the combat pilot's ability to compartmentalize fear, to process threats as tactical problems requiring solutions. "Moving me makes it obvious that something happened in this meeting. If I just walk out the way I came in, transfer request denied, nothing changes. I'm just another pilot who didn't make the cut." "Except you're not another pilot," Vance said from her position by the door. "You're Thomas Voss, brother of Alara Voss, in possession of case numbers that could unravel a conspiracy that's been protected for over a decade. Walking out of here like nothing happened is the same as painting a target on your back and hoping the sniper misses." "Then what do you suggest?" Haverly was working 3 phones simultaneously, sending encrypted messages with the practiced speed of someone who'd done this before. "Patricia, get him to transport. Use the maintenance tunnels, not the main corridors. We'll stage a medical emergency. Equipment malfunction during his medical evaluation. Needs immediate attention at the hospital." He looked up at Thomas. "Can you fake chest pains convincingly?" Before Thomas could answer, Vance's phone buzzed. She checked it and her face went pale. "We're too late. OSI just put out a priority flag on Captain James Ray's. No stated reason, but it originated from an office that doesn't officially exist." The security apparatus was already in motion, the machinery that had tried to kill Alara now recognizing that her brother represented an equal threat. Thomas felt time compressing the way it did during combat, that strange dilation where seconds became elastic and decisions had to be made faster than conscious thought allowed. "How long before they get here?" 15 minutes, maybe less." Haverly had stopped multitasking and was now focused entirely on Thomas. "You need to decide right now whether you trust me, whether you're willing to disappear the way your sister did, because that's the only option that keeps you and your daughters alive." The mention of his daughters sent ice through Thomas's chest. "They'll go after my children. They'll surveil them," Vance said. "Use them as leverage, as bait. Standard protocol when the primary target goes dark." She met his eyes. "But Alara spent 13 years protecting you from exactly this scenario. She built contingencies, established protocols, set up systems that we're only now beginning to understand. If you run, if you let us help you disappear, those systems activate." Thomas thought of his daughters, Maya and Rebecca, 7 and 9, who'd already lost their mother to cancer, who'd already endured more grief than children should carry. The idea of vanishing from their lives, of becoming another parent who abandoned them, was almost unbearable. Almost. But the alternative was worse. The weight of the decision pressed down on Thomas like altitude change during a rapid descent, his ears ringing with the pressure of choosing between impossible options. His daughters' faces filled his mind, Maya with her gap-toothed smile and obsession with constellations, Rebecca with her quiet intensity and the way she'd started drawing airplanes in the margins of her homework. They'd already survived one parent's death. Could they survive another parent's disappearance? Where would I go? The question felt like surrender, like admitting defeat before the fight even began. But Colonel Haverly's expression suggested otherwise, not surrender but strategy, the kind of tactical withdrawal that saved forces for battles that mattered. Alara established a network, Haverly said, pulling out a tablet and encrypting the screen with a passcode that required both fingerprint and retinal scan. Safe houses, false identities, financial accounts under names that don't connect to anything. She built it gradually over 13 years, knowing that eventually you might need it. He turned the screen toward Thomas, showing a document that looked like a flight plan but contained addresses, contact protocols, and resources that represented his sister's paranoia transformed into preparedness. She planned for this exact scenario. Major Vance had moved away from the door, now working her own phone with quick efficiency. Your daughters are currently at Meadowbrook Elementary, correct? They're in aftercare until you pick them up at 1800 hours. Thomas nodded, his throat tight. We have people there, Vance continued. Not Air Force, not anyone who will trigger attention. Civilian contractors that Alara vetted personally. They've been monitoring your family for years as part of her protective detail. They can extract your daughters within 30 minutes, have them at a secure location within 2 hours. Extract them. Thomas's voice rose despite his training. You're talking about kidnapping my children. We're talking about saving them, Haverly cut in, his tone allowing no argument. The same people who tried to kill your sister won't hesitate to use your daughters as leverage. They're safer with us in protection than they are in that school waiting for you to pick them up on schedule while OSI agents converge on your position. The logic was sound, but logic didn't account for the visceral terror of losing his children, of letting them disappear into a system even if that system was designed to protect them. Thomas felt like he was fragmenting, the pilot part of his brain accepting the tactical necessity, the father part screaming rejection, the brother part wondering if Alara had felt this same terrible calculus when she'd chosen to disappear rather than risk bringing danger home. How long would we be gone? We don't know, Haverly admitted, and the honesty was somehow worse than a comforting lie would have been. It depends on what you know, what the evidence reveals, how deeply the corruption runs. Could be months, could be years. Maya and Rebecca growing up in hiding, moving from safe house to safe house, their childhood stolen by a conspiracy Thomas hadn't even known existed until an hour ago. The injustice of it burned. There has to be another way, Thomas said, but even he could hear the desperation in his voice, the hope without foundation. Vance's expression softened with something like sympathy. There is another way. You walk out of here, collect your daughters, go home, and pretend this conversation never happened. Accept that Alara died 13 years ago. Burn the case numbers she gave you. Live a normal life. The alternative hung in the air between them, superficially appealing but fundamentally impossible. Thomas had spent 13 years believing his sister was dead, building a life on the foundation of that grief, and now he was being offered the chance to unknow what he just learned, to return to the comfortable fiction that had sustained him through flight school, through marriage, through his wife's death and the desperate years of single parenthood that followed. All he had to do was forget. Forget that Alara had survived. Forget that she'd spent her final years watching over him. Forget the case numbers that represented evidence of a conspiracy that had nearly killed her. Forget that everything he'd become as a pilot was because she'd refused to let him fail even from the shadows of her hidden life. I can't unknow this, Thomas said quietly, even if I wanted to. Colonel Haverly nodded as if he'd expected this answer, perhaps even needed it. Then we moved to Phase 2. Patricia, initiate extraction protocol. I want both girls secured within 20 minutes. He turned back to Thomas. You'll need to make a choice about what you tell them. They're 7 and 9. What am I supposed to say? The truth adapted for their understanding, Vance suggested. She'd holstered her weapon and her tone had shifted from tactical to almost gentle. That you have to go away for work, that it's important that they'll be safe. Children are more resilient than we give them credit for, especially when they trust the adult telling them things. Thomas thought of the last time he deployed, how Rebecca had cried for 3 days and Maya had gone silent, refusing to speak except in whispers. They'd already lost their mother to cancer that had come suddenly, viciously, stealing her away in 6 months from diagnosis to death. Now their father was about to disappear into circumstances he barely understood, dragging them into danger because his sister had refused to let injustice stand unchallenged. "I need to talk to them," Thomas said. "Before extraction, I need them to hear my voice telling them it's okay." Haverly considered this, weighing operational security against psychological necessity. 5 minutes on a secure line. But Thomas, you tell them only what they need to know. Nothing about Alara, nothing about why this is happening, just that you love them and they need to trust the people who come for them. The colonel's expression hardened. And you better make those 5 minutes count, because once extraction begins, you won't see them again until this is over. The phone felt impossibly heavy in Thomas's hand. He dialed the aftercare center's number, providing the security code that would allow him to speak to his daughters. While he waited for someone to fetch them, he became aware of Vance speaking rapidly into her own phone, coordinating movements and resources with the efficiency of someone executing a well-rehearsed plan. Alara's plan, Thomas realized. His sister had choreographed this emergency years ago, had built the infrastructure for protecting her brother's family with the same meticulous attention she'd brought to flight planning. "Daddy," Rebecca's voice came through the phone, tentative but hopeful. "Hi, sweetheart. Is Maya there with you?" "I'm here." Maya's voice bubbled in the background, and Thomas closed his eyes against the wave of emotion that threatened to break his tactical composure. "I need you both to listen carefully," he began, keeping his voice steady through sheer force of will. The conversation with his daughters lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Thomas tracked it automatically, pilot instinct measuring every resource against the limits of what was available. He told them he loved them. He told them some friends would pick them up from school, people he trusted completely, and that they should go without fear or argument. He told them they were going on an adventure, that he'd join them soon, that everything would be okay even though he wasn't certain he believed it himself. Rebecca asked why, her 9-year-old's intuition sensing the wrongness beneath his reassurances. Maya asked if they could bring their stuffed animals. Thomas said yes to the animals and gave Rebecca the only truth he could, because sometimes keeping people safe means doing things that seem scary at first. When he ended the call, his hands were shaking. Major Vance touched his shoulder briefly, a gesture of solidarity from one warrior to another, then returned to her phone to confirm that extraction teams were moving into position. Haverly had pulled up security feeds on his computer, monitoring the base's entry points with the intensity of someone expecting hostile contact. "We've got movement," Haverly said suddenly, his voice tight. "2 vehicles, civilian plates but government issue. They're heading for the administrative building." ETA 3 minutes. Thomas felt his training snap into place, the emotional turmoil forced into a compartment he could access later if there was a later. "What's the play?" "Maintenance tunnels," Vance said, moving to a filing cabinet and pulling out what looked like routine documents but was actually a false front for a keypad. She entered a code and the entire cabinet swung outward, revealing a narrow passage that led downward into darkness. "These tunnels connect every major building on base." Alara mapped them during her time here, found routes that aren't on official blueprints. Thomas stared at the hidden passage, understanding with sudden clarity that his sister had spent years building a resistance network within the very institution she'd served, preparing for a war that most people didn't know was being fought. "She knew they'd come back," he said. "She knew whoever tried to kill her wouldn't just give up." Haverly was already moving toward the passage, grabbing a go bag from behind his desk that looked like it had been packed and ready for years. Alara knew that corruption protected tends to metastasize, that given enough time, the people who tried to silence one inconvenient pilot would try to silence others. She spent her hidden years documenting everything, building evidence, and creating the infrastructure to protect the people who might eventually expose what she couldn't. The sounds of footsteps in the outer corridor cut off further explanation. Vance ushered Thomas toward the hidden passage, following him into the darkness while Haverly paused at the entrance. "I'll delay them," the colonel said. "Buy you 20 minutes. There's a safe house address in the go bag. Get there, wait for contact. And Thomas. Haverly's expression held something Thomas had seen in his sister's eyes during those midnight training sessions, the look of someone who decided that some things were worth fighting for no matter the cost. Your sister didn't die protecting evidence. She lived protecting the idea that people in uniform should be able to tell the truth without fear. Don't let that die with her. Then Haverly was closing the cabinet, sealing them in darkness, and Thomas could hear muffled voices from the office above, official tones making official demands, the machinery of investigation beginning its work. The maintenance tunnel stretched ahead into darkness broken only by emergency lighting at 20-foot intervals, creating pools of sickly yellow illumination that made the concrete walls look jaundiced. Thomas followed Major Vance through the narrow passage, his shoulders brushing both sides, his breathing echoing in the confined space. Above them, through layers of concrete and institutional infrastructure, he could hear the muffled sounds of the investigation, furniture moving, voices demanding cooperation, the organized chaos of a search designed to look official while accomplishing something else entirely. Vance moved with the confidence of someone who'd walked these tunnels before, navigating intersections without hesitation, occasionally checking a map on her phone that showed schematic overlays Thomas didn't recognize. Alara updated these maps monthly, Vance said without looking back. She'd do maintenance runs during her off hours, claiming she was just staying fit. Really, she was documenting every access point, every security camera blind spot, every emergency exit that hadn't been sealed properly. How long was she planning her disappearance? Thomas asked, his voice strange in the enclosed space. From the beginning, I think, even before the sabotage attempt. Vance paused at a junction where 4 tunnels met, checking her phone before taking the leftmost path. She told me once that the moment you put on a uniform, you accept that someone might want you dead for doing your job correctly. She just prepared for that inevitability more thoroughly than most. They walked in silence for several minutes, descending deeper into the base's substructure, passing through sections that looked abandoned, rusted pipes, cracked concrete, evidence of water damage that facilities management had never bothered to address this far below ground level. Thomas wondered how many service members passed through the buildings above without knowing this entire network existed beneath their feet, this infrastructure of shadows and contingencies. The safe house, Thomas said. Is it on base? Off base, 20 miles north. Farmhouse owned by a shell company that traces back to 7 different corporate entities before hitting a wall of attorney-client privilege. Vance's voice carried a note of admiration. Your sister was thorough. The property has been maintained for 12 years, utilities paid regularly, but never occupied for more than a few days at a time. Perfect safe house, legitimate paper trail that doesn't connect to anything useful. They emerged from the tunnels into a maintenance building on the base's western edge, the transition from underground to above ground so abrupt that Thomas had to stop and orient himself. Vance moved immediately to a locked cabinet, retrieving keys and a worn jacket that she threw to Thomas. Civilian clothes in the bag. Change quickly. Vehicles outside. Thomas opened the go-bag Haverly had provided, finding not just clothes but documents, driver's license, credit cards, even family photos that showed him with his daughters but in places they'd never been, vacation spots he didn't recognize. Alara's work again, building a false history detailed enough to withstand casual inspection. How many people has she done this for? Thomas asked while changing, replacing his flight suit with jeans and a nondescript windbreaker. Just you as far as we know, Vance said, but the infrastructure she built could protect dozens. That was her plan eventually. Create a system that could shelter whistleblowers, protect witnesses, extract people whose crime was telling the truth. She handed him a set of car keys attached to a keychain showing a faded photograph of an F-16. She never stopped being a pilot, Thomas. She just started flying different missions. The vehicle was a 10-year-old Ford pickup, weathered and anonymous, the kind of truck that disappeared into rural landscapes without attracting attention. Thomas climbed into the driver's seat while Vance took passenger, her hand resting casually near the concealed weapon at her hip. The engine started with a rough cough that smoothed into a reliable rumble, and Thomas pulled away from the maintenance building with the careful speed of someone who understood that drawing attention was the same as tactical failure. The base's western gate was less monitored than main entry points, designed primarily for contractor traffic and supply deliveries. Vance had credentials that got them through with minimal scrutiny: a brief conversation with the gate guard, a scan of her ID card, a wave forward. Then they were off base, merging into civilian traffic, becoming indistinguishable from the thousands of other vehicles moving through the sprawl around the military installation. "Your daughters are secure," Vance said, checking her phone. "Extraction completed 8 minutes ago. They're en route to a different location, better that you don't know where yet. But they're safe, they have their stuffed animals, and they're with people trained to work with children." Thomas gripped the steering wheel tighter, fighting the urge to turn around to demand the address, to abandon operational security for the simple human need to see his children. "How do you live like this? How did Alara live like this?" "One day at a time," Vance said. "One mission at a time. You focus on the immediate tactical problem and trust that the strategic situation will resolve eventually." She was quiet for a moment, watching the landscape slide past. "But I won't lie to you, it's corrosive. The hiding, the false identities, the constant awareness that someone might recognize you. Alara handled it better than most would have, but it changed her. The woman who disappeared 13 years ago wasn't quite the same woman who showed up at Randolph to teach you." Thomas thought about his sister as he'd known her at the memorial service, vibrant, confident, seemingly indestructible. Then he thought about the woman who'd found him in that hangar at midnight 6 years ago, quieter, more careful, with shadows in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "She seemed tired," he said, "when she taught me, like she was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical fatigue." "She was dying," Vance reminded him gently. "Brain cancer untreated. But also, yes, she was tired."